Yeah, welcome back to a new episode of Oh Man, That's Awful, coming to you from the luxurious studios of Radio Titans in Los Angeles. I'm your host, one of your hosts, Carl Kozlowski, and with me, as always, is...
I'm Kevin Corcoran. Happy New Year, everybody.
And you might hear chiming in or chuckling from the soundboard, Dr. David Robinson. But today, our special guest on this show, in which we ask people to recount funny, awful stories from their lives and... crazy situations they've lived through and how they overcame them. We have often it's comedians or actors, but today we have one of the most storied and acclaimed producers in Los Angeles TV journalism over the past 4 decades. His name is Ken Davis, and he not only is an Emmy-winning, multiple Emmy-winning producer on channels 2 and 9 and 13, but he also did national shows at the CBS Evening News, and he has a new book out called In Bed with Broadcasting, in which he tells stories from behind the scenes and off the air. So, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Ken Davis. How you doing?
I am honored by that introduction. I hope I can live up to it all.
Carl's got a real knack for reducing a person's career down to about 2 sentences.
What? I thought it was a lot of pumping up. Anyway.
Well, I hope my mother listens to this.
Yes.
He left out handsome.
I'm waiting for the check in the mail,
No.
but yeah. So, yeah, so Ken.
I'm not sure about handsome either.
Wow. So, so Ken, what prompted you to try writing the book at this time? I mean, you've had a long career and a lot of crazy things have developed over time, but was there anything about the particular climate right now that, and I don't mean the weather, but that inspired this?
Well, believe it or not, with the title, it's not about all the current casting couch stories. About In Bed with Broadcasting is how the industry became my mistress. But it certainly has become very timely with what's been happening in the news lately. Question, I was actually sitting in a bar in Pasadena, not that I'm a heavy drinker, but my best friend and I were chatting and going over my career, and I was joking with him how I started at the top and worked my way down. But all in between, there was all kinds of crazy adventures, and he said, you ought to write a book. And so 2 years later, it comes out. I hope people like it.
Yeah, no, I've checked it out already, and it's pretty entertaining. You've got like quite a few crazy stories in there, but a couple of them, are pretty harrowing. But there is quite a few funny ones as well. And I know that you once stumbled across the lifeless body of a screen legend.
That's what I understand. It's one of the in the news department. Anything can happen, and I talk about it in Bed with Broadcasting. This particular one was I was working at CBS Network at TV City here in Los Angeles, and it was like a Saturday morning, and I lazily picked up the phone, and some guy just started talking to me, saying, "Let's see." He says, "Listen to me. I've got something very important to tell you." And I said, "Who is this?" And he goes, "Doesn't matter. CBS was her favorite network. I haven't called anyone else. I want you to be the first to know." And I said, "No, what?" And he said, "A legend has died." And I said, "Who?" He said, "Mae West." Now, and then he hung up the phone. Back then, not so much today, everybody knew Mae West. She was a staple of late-night TV and everything else. But we also didn't have phone ID back then, so I had no idea who the hell called. And so I jumped in my car, and I went over to, I happen to know where she lived, the Ross McCock Park District of L.A., and snuck into the building, or walked into the building, and asked the concierge. I explained I was from CBS News. I knew she lived up in the penthouse. That's where she used to take guys when she said, "Why don't you come out and see me sometime?"
Wow.
And
on
I
a
asked
nightly
him,
basis.
I said it was with CBS News, and I understand Miss West has passed away. And he laughed at me and said, "Oh, no, sir, I would," and sort of blew me off. But then I walked outside thinking, damn it, only in the news business do you get upset when somebody's not dead. It's not a major exclusive.
I can think of a few people.
Sorry to admit that. But anyway, I decided just not to believe the word of some dude in the lobby, and saw a family of 4 walking into to the apartment building, and snuck in behind them and rode the elevator up to the penthouse. Because I figured she lived in the penthouse, and came out the elevator. There was only one room with 2 doors, knocked on it, and this man in tears answers the door and leads me in place, and suddenly starts walking down a hallway, pointing out all these pictures of Mae in her prime and talking about her in the past tense. And in the meantime, I'm thinking as a news guy that the network news in New York airs in a half an hour from then. And I needed to find out quickly whether or not Mae West was in fact dead. And he refused to admit it. He just kept saying, oh, she, saved Paramount Pictures. And she was into civil rights when Martin Luther King was a toddler, and just kept going on and on and on. I came off, and I said, sir, I really feel your loss, but I have to know for sure if Mae is gone before I call my bosses in New York. And he says, come this way.
Oh, no.
And we walk to a bedroom, and it gets warmer as we get closer. And he opens the door, and there in the corner is a crinkled face of some old man with a candle next to him.
Oh, I thought that was me.
Behind him, I see a circular bed with a sleeping bag on it and feathering blonde hair coming out the top of the sleeping bag.
Oh,
and I quickly figured out, I averted my eyes, thinking my eyes were fooling me, and then I looked back again, and I see a forehead, and I realize I'm looking at Mae West's body. And I just freaked out. I wanted to get the heck out of there, but I kept my composure and said to the gentleman, I am sorry for your loss. I've got to go. And now it's like 20 minutes before the news is going to air across the nation. And I run across the street to a service station, and I find a phone booth. I call CBS hotline in New York, and then they asked me in 5 minutes, can I go live on the CBS radio network and report her death to millions of people? And I just winged it as a guy who looked like a recent prison inmate, pumped gas a couple of feet away from me, and reported her death. And then they led it with the news that night. Wow. That we exclusively learned Mae West had passed away. I later learned the gentleman who answered the door was a former Las Vegas bodybuilder who was with her for like 30 years and the love of her life. And the guy sitting in the room was her doctor. And the guy who lived with her, didn't want her body to be taken away. He couldn't stand to see her go, but he felt, he wanted to see it on the news, I guess, to make it real. So just another day in the news business.
Wow. I mean, you're lucky that she didn't spring back to life or something, because, you're having to watch from a distance.
That would have been, if Mae came alive, then that would make an entire new book by itself.
Would have ruined your career.
I'm sure she would have had a witty line to go with it, too. But do you have any other bizarre celebrity encounters before we get to the really creepy stuff?
Well, yeah. I mean, in the news business, anything can happen. But it was Phil Spector, and I say that with quotes around fun. Well, you probably know he was later arrested for murder. But back in the 70s, I produced the news at Channel 13 in Los Angeles, and we turned out to be his favorite newscast. I don't know why. It was a horrible newscast, but for some reason.
Don't be modest.
And
the sound was probably great, though.
Right. Anyway, he called up late one night. He had the hots for our anchor woman, Hetty Lynn Hurdy. She's now on radio at KPCC. And invited the anchor man and the anchor lady over to his house. And I was an old DJ and loved Phil Spector music. From the Ronettes to the Righteous Brothers to the final Beatles albums. I was a huge Phil Spector fan.
Still the best Christmas album, I think, ever.
Ahead.
Oh, Phil! I was just saying, Phil Spector's Christmas album, A Gift from Phil Spector, brilliant.
Without a doubt.
Definitely the best.
Hear it, every Christmas time is fantastic.
Definitely the best Christmas album ever made by a convicted murderer. I'm going to say that. The music kills, but...
You never heard O.J. Simpson's Hanukkah
album. Great Hanukkah favorites. I have O.J. Simpson story, too.
Oh, yeah, we want to hear that, too. We'll do it back-to-back. So what happened with Phil, then?
Well, to button up the Spector story, we went over that night, and then I ended up going, I had my 20s, I'd go over every night after the news, and this went on for about 6 months, and met everybody from Bob Dylan to Leonard Cohen, John Lennon called, and all kinds of fun. Wow. And ended up being on a Phil Spector Leonard Cohen album called Death of a Ladies' Man. Oh, wow. And but then Phil started drinking and got crazier and crazier and pulled a gun on Leonard Cohen.
What?
And late one night I decided I was going to say, cut him off, that I wasn't going to see him anymore. I don't want him to live too much. But I decided not to do a cold turkey. I invited two of my buddies from high school to come over and meet Phil. And we were going to go to Century City and go hear some jazz players. And Phil was drinking quite a bit. And he had ordered a limo to pick us up to go out that night, and the limo driver arrived, and Phil was convinced the guy was a photographer for the National Enquirer, and pulled a gun on him and ordered him off his property. And then he turns around and points the gun at my friends, and then points it right at my head, and said I was responsible for bringing the National Enquirer there and different things. And he literally had his finger on the trigger. And that's how I end chapter 2.
Wow.
But obviously, because I'm still here today, but that's just another fun story.
Just the old Phil Spector wall of news. That's what
did he have the bizarre
Go ahead.
The bizarre head hair then, or was that only established during court? Because he was famous during his trial. He was famous during his murder trial for the weird wigs.
Well, let me tell you. Well, the real story on that a lot of people don't know. Yeah, the wig was quite. Phil was in a serious car accident in the 70s and was very insecure about his looks. That's why he was upset about the National Enquirer being there, and so he started wearing wigs. I'm not a big fan of the wig he was wearing when he was later in the murder situation. But yeah, he always had a wig. And the other thing is, when you're at Phil Spector's mansion, and this one was in Beverly Hills, the actual murder took place in Alhambra when he had moved. You'd go in there and he would lock the doors, and you were stuck. You were there for the night. If you're there at 9 at night, you couldn't leave till 7 the next morning, and you'd stay up, and we all night long drinking Cavassier and. Manischewitz wine. I used to joke he's the only person I knew that went back and forth from, rare French cognac to cheap kosher wine.
I think that's the real headline.
Phil was a very insecure guy, and I have a whole theory on that murder. That's, I think, exactly what happened. I think that Lana Clarkson, the actress, wanted to leave, and he wouldn't let her leave. The door was locked, and he did on us. However, accidentally it went off, and he killed her. So I feel lucky that I survived that.
I would.
Wow. I mean, I would think that maybe the car accident happened because of having too big a wig on, unless it really did start after the fact. But hey,
Phil was brilliant, but a strange dude.
Yeah. Well, so do you leave people at like a cliffhanger, or was that where it ended? I mean, I don't want to take away from people getting the book. So if it's a cliffhanger,
no, that's part of the fun of the book. It goes up and down, and it's told, I think, unbiased in an entertaining fashion. It ends on a cliffhanger, but then the next chapter begins on how I escaped and didn't get killed.
Oh wow! Okay.
Fortunately, his bodyguard pretty much tackled him, and I managed to escape. Wow. But however, it was soon after that. Speaking of fun times. I was working for Channel 2 after Channel 13 here in Los Angeles, and the Hillside Strangler case.
Uh-oh.
Now, the book is not just all about murders and hate and different things. There's some funny stories and love stories and everything else, but those of us who grew up in Southern California remember the Hillside Strangler. It was in the late 70s, and about once a week, a young lady would end up being found thrown on a hillside. That's where it got its name. I call it because it was a monster. And this continued for like a year and a half. And the city literally, I write in the book, in bed with broadcasting, I might say, so people won't forget the name. I write in the book that Los Angeles is obviously one of the biggest cities in the world. But during the Hillside Strangler, it felt like a small town in Iowa because all they could talk about was the Hillside Strangler. And it was like a flammable, invisible gas in the air of fear. And so I was at Channel 2 and decided I wanted to take the story a step further and make it my story somehow. And what happened was a gentleman was arrested up in Washington State. And it turned out they figured out was involved with the stranglings, because they found jewelry at his home from some of the victims. And to get out of going to the gas chamber, he told the police, "I'll tell you who the other person was." They figured there had to be two hillside stranglers, and because they were able to move the bodies onto hillsides, and it would take two people to do it. And he implicated his cousin, a guy named Angelo Bono, who ran an auto upholstery shop in Glendale. However, they didn't have enough evidence to arrest Angelo, so there was a short period of time where we knew Angelo Bono was